So hi everyone, thank you for joining us this evening or this morning in some parts of the world. My name is Sarah. Many of you already know me. I'm an adjunct professor at the Center for Water Research at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at ISER in Pune. And I'm also the founder of the virtual museum Living Waters, which is jointly organizing this season of Watertalks on how do we communicate water towards a new water ethics. So just a few words in terms of housekeeping. Please keep yourself muted and your cameras off unless you're speaking. We do have actually one of the speakers with poor connectivity issues right now. So we don't want to load up the bandwidth for her. I'm very, very thrilled to have with us this evening Gauri Raje and Minket Lepcha, both of whom have been working with us at Living Waters Museum for the last 2 years or more, in Gauri, your case, I think. And unfortunately, we've not been able to do any physical storytelling events for some time, but prior to the lockdown, we were doing quite a few in Ahmedabad with Gauri. So Gauri is joining in from Scotland and Minket from the Northeast India. And both of them will self-introduce themselves in a second or two. But I wanted to just say a few words about the topic for this evening: water, migration, mapping, and memories. And the questions that were raised in the abstract: how would the world look like if we were not defined by geopolitical boundaries carved on land, but by water? How do you draw boundaries on water? How do you draw a map which is on water? If you look back to the ancient art of making maps that dates to the 6th century BC with the Greeks, what was called cartography. Maps helped humans to navigate the world. But in doing so, that navigation led to trade, it led to the building of empires, it led to indentured labor being transported to the new world, it led to all sorts of other things, as I think best brought out now in Amitav Ghosh's new book on the nutmeg trade from Indonesia, led by the Dutch, and what that meant for indigenous communities. So mapping, migration, and how we recall water are so interconnected, and that is what we're talking about this evening through the power of stories, folk stories, myths, mythologies, and the real world. So without further ado, let me ask our speakers to briefly introduce themselves. Gauri, you can go first, and then Minket, I hope you can put your camera on at that time, Minket.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for inviting me today for this panel discussion. I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Minket because our paths have crossed now a couple of times, and it'd be nice to engage in a juicy discussion with her. I'm Gauri Raje, as my little nameplate says. And I am what I would say a first generation migrant to the UK. So I've been living in the UK now for the last 20 years, in Scotland for the last 5 years. But my sort of home is in two places. I have family back in India, as Sarah mentioned. So apart from the COVID times, I tended to spend half my time in the UK and half in India. More recently, I've been engaging a lot in terms of looking at stories as repository of collective memories and memory making as well. So I've been kind of working quite a bit in India on stories from my ancestral lineage. So looking at the regions where the stories come from and what are the stories that are alive today in those areas, namely, in my case, Gujarat and Maharashtra. And on the other hand, in Scotland, it's a lot has been about making home and how do stories allow us to make home. So that's kind of briefly what I do as a storyteller. Sarah asked me to speak a bit about my journey as a storyteller. Very briefly, my initial training is as an anthropologist, and I used to work at the University of Warwick, as well as I was in Delhi University for a while, and a lot of my projects involved the South Gujarat area, the Dang and the Surat district, where I worked with the Tapi River Dam displacees, and then in the Dangs with issues of forest ecology and medicine. And then at a certain point, I think I just realized that anthropology, I was working with narratives anyways a lot. And I realized that the academic language was not allowing me to reflect the experiences of fieldwork. And so it was in search of a different language of expression that I moved on from my career as an academic, and now I work a lot with storytelling and the orality and what that involves in expressing experiences and translating them. Why water stories? So I've been working on water stories or water stories around water for the past, I think must be about 4 or 5 years. And a lot of that journey happened by way of noticing a certain kind of consonance, a certain kind of overlap and commonality between water and stories and storytelling. So I was in search of, there's a very elemental connection which we may talk about in this session today, but that's what led me into looking at water stories and the different kind of water stories that are. So that's me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gauri. We'll hear more from you in a minute. Minket, I hope your camera is working now. So Minket last year had a very exciting project with us, with a small grant from the British Council heritage grant to work in the Northeast with young women, stories, waterways, and art. And I think it was an amazing project, a very, very empowering project for the young girls involved. And the fact that it was all coordinated, done, and facilitated, you know, from Nepal to India to the Northeast during a very, very difficult time for all of us. So Minket, over to you to talk a little bit about yourself and your journey as a story.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, go ahead, Minket.
Yes. I'll introduce myself because I'm going on and off the connection here. So my name is Minket Lepcha. I'm from Darjeeling, and I am a filmmaker as well as a storyteller, and I've been documenting oral stories and folk narrative from indigenous communities across Himalaya. And one of the main reasons why I kind of use storytelling as a method is to connect at an experiential level with the children and with the women, talking about how folk narrate connected with nature and ecology. So I'm really excited. Forgive me if I go on and off, but the idea is to connect with all of you. I'm really excited to be a part of this journey. Yeah, this is climate change right now, right here. Because of electricity, I'm facing problems. So yeah, thank you so much.
Now, thanks a lot, Minket. So I know it's a hard time for you over there right now. I know it's been raining a lot as well in the eastern and the northern part of the country, as well as the south. So let's see what we can do. So maybe we'll go back to you, Gauri, and invite you to share a story and to, talk a little bit more about your work around water and mapping.
Sure. Yeah, so I thought I'd start with a story from a very, very old story from these isles, from the British Isles, let's put it that way. And it's a story, I was thinking about the stories that I could tell today, and I thought something about the relationship of water to memory, but also, when we think of water, we tend to think of water that's visible, the rivers and the seas, and that we can feel and touch. And this is a very old story which connects to the waters that are connected underground. And so water being mapped in a slightly different way as well, the mapping in our memories, if you will. So here is a story from the Isles of Britain. And it's a story that begins a long time ago when these islands were not really known as England or Britain. They were known as the Kingdom of Logres. And in this kingdom was ruled over by a personage called the Fisher King. Now, the Fisher King represented abundance. And I can tell you that the islands were abundant. They were abundant with life. They were abundant with forests. They were abundant overground, in the air. There were animals that roamed about. There were falcons and sparrowhawks and wolves and bears, badgers and foxes. The islands babbled with sound. And at this time, there was an understood contract between the humans and the land. And this was the contract. The contract was that the land would offer nourishment to everyone. Everyone could feed off it. Everyone could take what they needed. But the land asked that it be cared for. And that was the contract, that if the beings above ground who lived on land cared for the land and everything on it, the waters, the beings, each other, the land would give of itself. What held the land together were wells. The wells that were dotted across the land, they were holy wells. They carried waters that emerged above ground from the other worlds, and they were the lifebloods of this land. The wells were connected to each other in ways that you or I or our ancestors couldn't even see, but they could feel them. And with each of these wells, the places where the wells arose and arrived in our world, each of the wells had a maiden that looked after the well. She was known as the guardian of the well, the custodian of the wells. And these maidens, they tended the wells, and they were called the voices of the wells. Each time a traveler passed by the wells, the maiden would offer them hospitality. She would offer them the sweet waters of the well. She would offer them the food. She would offer them a place to rest. And that is how life moved on these islands. At a certain point of time, a king began to rule. His name was King Amangons. And King Amangons, well, I couldn't say whether it was the kind of rashness of youth, whether it was arrogance, whether it was just the sense of power. that he held, but he completely forgot about this contract. He knew he was the ruler. He had the power to legislate, to regulate, and he wasn't going to listen to anyone. And once upon a time, when King Aman-Gons was touring the lands, he came across one of the wells, and there was the maiden of the well. She saw the king, she saw his armies, and as was the manner, she welcomed them. She fed them, she offered them the sweet waters and a place of rest. And King Aman-Gons was happy. This is the way things should be. He was the king. He should be offered hospitality in this way and no less. And this got to his head. The thoughts whirred about, and he quite forgot about the land. He forgot about the people. He just saw a maiden who was offering him hospitality. And the thoughts whirled and scurried in his head till he didn't know what he was doing, or maybe he knew really well what he was doing, but he grabbed the maiden, and in front of his whole army, disregarding any voice of protest, he violated her. He not only violated her, he imprisoned her and hauled her away to his palace to serve him. When a king does this in front of his entire army, well, all those men in the army, they saw it as permission. And so the army went berserk. It raided the lands, it raided the women, the wells, the voices. And the land was in turmoil. Word got around, people fled, beings fled, animals, birds disappeared. And the voices of the well, they felt the tremor. And all the maidens retreated back into the wells, and the waters were sucked down back into the underworld and the other world till the waters were dry. There was no more water. The land grew parched. And over time, the fisher king disappeared. Abundance was no more. Till the fisher king disappeared not only from the land, but also from the memories and the hearts of the beings on the land. And some say that he is gone now. But I like to believe that just like the waters, they've retreated into their homes, into the other worlds, where they wait for us to remember them and to invite them back into our worlds. And that is a story from a long, long time ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Gauri. I wish there was more and more chapters in the story, how did the waters come back? So do you have any idea how old the story is or where you sourced it from?
It's a story that's kind of experiencing a bit of a revival now. I haven't done as much research to find out what written sources the story comes from, but you hear it more and more from storytellers now. Mm-hmm. And it's an ancient story.
Yeah, but it's so way much for our time, right?
Sorry?
It's so much for our time. It's so...
It is. And I think that's what I find really fascinating about many of the water stories I've come across. They're almost like repositories of memories of courtesy towards the other than human worlds, towards the ways of courtesy towards water, especially in water stories, and also about the folly of humans. So to me, it's instructive that, when we talk about what we are doing to the world and the climate crisis, it is a moment in the history of the world and the beings. There have been many such moments of crises, but the stories remember those moments, and they invite us to kind of remember also what allowed the crises to be mitigated, to be addressed. So the answers are there, and ours is not a unique moment. Right. It's a moment of forgetting, but there is hope, I would like to think.
Right. Right. And it's also, when you look at whales around the world, I mean, in India, with the steppe whales and other kinds of whales, the way the feminine is associated with the care of the whale and the kind of, I mean, I don't want to do the juxtaposition of male versus female, and the male as the pillaging person and then the female as the carer and the nurturer, etc. But the stories do reflect some of that way that, we see nature, we see culture, we see technologies, we see degradation and all. And they are so pertinent, even though they probably date hundreds of years ago. And you wonder what has changed, really. The forms of water may have changed, or the forms of destruction may have changed, right?
Yeah. I think what's really interesting about the story is also that it doesn't talk about wells as just pools or storage sites. Mm-hmm. It talks about a whole network, and that what we see of water above ground is just a minuscule of, what kind of holds the worlds and lives together. There is a network. So I think the story is quite interesting to me for that. And coming to your second point, which I find quite interesting, I did a session on water stories a few months ago, and this question again came up, is a lot of water stories tend to be associated with women, female figures as the guardians, or water itself as female. And what I tend to see is it's not so much an association of water as woman and, as opposed to the other, other extreme of the gender, which would be the man. But it's a kind of representation of energies. There's something of the feminine, fluidity, and those two seem to be associated together. So it's not that all rivers around the world or that the seas are female. No. You have male rivers. You have bodies of water that are male, but it's an indication of the kind of fluidity that water permits, that seems to be associated with an energy that's identified as feminine. I mean, you and I both know that there are many women we might call very male or associate with a very masculine energy. And the masculine has its place as well. But I think what the stories are telling us is, where's the balance? Where's the balance? Where's the contract? So the contract in this story is that the king, who is associated, now the king could be female, could be a woman, but king indicates a certain kind of energy you require to hold, to guide, that is identified as masculine. And so there was a contract between the feminine and the masculine, that the feminine would nourish and hold, the masculine energy would be the guardian and would ensure that, beings remember the guardian nature. And when that goes out of kilter, then you have, skewed forms either ways. So yeah, that's something I wanted to just bring in.
Very, I mean, there's a lot more that we can talk about, and I hope that people will put this in the chat box. But I'd like to get to Minket right now, because I see she's online. I don't want to lose her. So Minket, if it's possible for you to open your screen, that would be wonderful.
Hi. I have managed to kind of log in through my phone because of the internet connection. So I just hope that you'll be able to see me, or if for that matter, even the presentation. So thank you so much, Sarah and Gauri, for such a beautiful story. As I'm trying to dabble with my internet connection, I could hear the masculine and female aspect of it. And so I come from an indigenous community, and where we have gods, which doesn't have a gender. So I resonate very well with that aspect. And I mean, also the fact that this particular story, we talk almost about migration from a very anthropogenic perspective, and this folklore, which I have taken from my community, talks about non-anthropogenic migration of beings, and also about rivers and also migratory birds. So today this is a story about Bandi Sang Yin, which means listen to the princess story. And so as I move on to the next slide, I would want to quickly talk about the mountain that I come from. I come from a mountain called Mountain Kanchenjunga. And if you go to the next slide, it is one of the ranges of the Himalaya. So we often forget that we are a part of this third pole that we talk about, which is filled with ice caps and kind of brings millions of, a livelihood through the rivers that melts from these mountains. And I come from the third highest peak, which is called Mount Kanchenjunga. We believe that we are from these white mountains, and the first men and women were born from these snow of the mountain peak, which is Kanchenjunga. And this is also about the times when these mountain peaks were not as big or high as we claim it to be these days, but it was as small as a musketeer's tooth. And it is about the time when all these beings used to talk with one another, where the magic and the interdependence and the interconnectedness was filled with gratitude and love and harmony for one another. And as we move on to another slide, I would like to quickly talk about, we had medicinal plants and trees which used to help us during the landslides. Like the Nepalensis elnus is a tree which is grown especially when there's a landslide, and the flowers like rhododendron found in the high peaks of these mountains right on the foothills of Kanchenjunga actually is a medicinal plant for us. So I'm talking about these times when there was a biodiversity and there was acknowledgement, not just from the human perspective, but from non-human perspective as well. And these are the beings which is still there in our surroundings. It's just that we forget to acknowledge them. And as we move on, we had birds. We still have birds coming from the eastern Nepal, like the Himalayan Munal, and literally one of the most beautiful birds which comes via River Teesta. So as the mountain Kanchenjunga melts, it becomes River Teesta for us. And one comes from the North Sikkim, another comes from the East Sikkim. And as we go to the next slide, I will show you this is the river trail that flows from the mountain Kanchenjunga. And because we talk about migration, we talk about human migration, but these are rivers which is migrating from one country to another, but these are just one river. And as you see the trail, it moves from India and goes down to Bangladesh and moves down to Bay of Bengal. So we have stories of fishes like golden mahseer, which used to come all the way from Bay of Bengal to lay eggs on the foothills of Mount Kanchenjunga. So as we move on to another slide, I would just talk about this beautiful story about the princess which was from the downstream of River Teesta. And it is about the times when she was known for her beauty, and such a beautiful lady who was known about her beauty from different parts of the country, like Bhutan, like Sikkim, like Assam. And so everyone wanted to marry her. And when we say princess, we say Pandi. Pandi is a name of a princess, or we refer to her as princess. So this Pandi was known for her beauty, and all the princes had come to kind of ask for her hand. But there was this Lepcha king who was very, very fond of her too. But there were so many kings who had asked for her hand, and he was really worried whether he would want to, he will be able to woo this lady. So it so happened that the day when everybody had come to ask her hand, the king said, give me one day to figure it out, what she has to think and what she wants from this particular, whom she wants to marry. And that very night, the king came by the jungle side and actually tried to woo the princess. And she was smitten by the king because the king of the Lepcha king happened to be very, very, very good looking and was very charming too. And then it so happened that when the dawn was about to break, both of them actually fled from that kingdom on the Assam, the downstream side, and then started moving upwards. And there is a place called Sevok just before you reach Darjeeling. And Sevok in Lepcha means Sufok, which means the whole jungle has been cleaned. So what they did was, in order to halt overnight, they actually cleaned the jungle, and they stood by and they just halted for the night. But the other kings came to know about this and the fact that it was a big betrayal from the kingdoms. And so they started literally following this princess and the king. And it so happened that everything was massacred in one night. But by luck, the king and the princess managed to flee from that place and went upstream. And as you move to the other slide, you will see that it followed the trace of River Teesta. So this is a Coronation Bridge, which is right just as you move upwards or as you move downstream. It divides the mountain communities with the downstream communities. So it just went up, and then, they started fleeing up, and then it was just worried like they will be caught. But somehow they managed to come up in the mountains of Himalaya or the Sikkim at this point of time. And as she was there as a bride and she kind of managed to settle down, but somehow she was missing her mother very, very badly. And she used to look by the riverside and look at her and say, this is the same river which flows down. And I wish that I can just say something to my mother through the river. So one day she stood by the riverside and asked the River Teesta to listen to her. Now, if you go by the folklore and the stories told by our ancestors, the body and the nature of the rivers are not the same as it is now. It was a violent river. It was a very violent, ferocious River Teesta. So the very fact that the river stood by and listened is that river which is just below the Coronation Bridge. I managed to catch a glimpse of what the nature of river would be like, but if you go towards the next slide, it says, the folklore says, that the river stood by, the violent river stood by and listened to what the queen had to say to her mother. And the queen said, "My dear mother, I want to send this message through this river to tell you that I miss you very much and I miss my home and my family. But in a hurry, as I was fleeing up in the mountains, I could not take anything with me because all the kings were there to kill us. So I took 3 things. One was a pumpkin seed. Can you just move to the other slide? One was a pumpkin seed, which is in Lepcha we call tungatli. The second one I have is the cucumber seed. The next slide. Sorry, the maize, which is called kunchungli. The third one, which is the cucumber seed, which is saratli. So I have these 3 seeds, but I have no idea how to grow this, because as a young princess, I just did not even take your blessing. Then I went up with these things that I had, but I really don't know. So my dear mother, I'm sending this message through this River Teesta to tell me, how do I actually grow this seed and how do I survive in these mountains? And the River Teesta stood by and listened to the news that it had to carry the memories of the prince or the queen now to her mother. And it stood by, and it slowly, the memory was taken from the water to the downstream community. And when mother came to hear about this, she was utterly missing her daughter too. And she was thinking, how do I send this message upwards? Because the river does not go upwards. How do I do this? So it so happened that there is a bird. Can you go to the next slide, please? So there is a bird called demoiselle crane. It is the migratory bird. In Lepcha, it is called karnokfo. And it is known to fly for a long, long time and for many, many hours, taking the sands of the river, sometimes eating the pebbles to keep their stomach full and fly for a very long time. So mother decided that I'm going to send this message to this bird because, number one, this bird knows how to fly for a very long time. And since this is the time when actually it moves upwards, because I know it comes from China and it moves towards the Himalaya and goes from Africa to go back to its mountains, I'm sure this bird is going to give this news. So as the birds were flying by, the mother says, "Hey, my dear birds, hey, Kernokfo, four means bird. Kernokfo, could you please send this message to my daughter that whenever you come, you have to, these are the 3 seeds that you have to grow." So when the bird heard about this, they heard and they started flying. Can you move to the next slide? So when they started flying, it is known that it is always flies in a V shape. Many of our aircraft, trainings, and even like in the Hindu mythology, this bird has been mentioned because like an army, the way they kind of move is in a V shape, and it was inspired by this bird. So demorsal crane is always known for flying in a V-shaped formation. So till now, our elders believe that whenever this bird fly, it makes the sound in, Pranokfo is in Lepcha. In Nepali, it is called karangkurung, and it makes karangkurung, this kind of a sound. So, and it started moving upwards to the Kalampong side. And then the bird, then the prince or the queen came to know, oh, this is the time that I have to sow the seeds. Now, if you look to if I move on to the other slide, you will see that this bird, can you move to the other slide, please? This is the migration of these demorsal crane, which not only flies it from the China side, it also moves towards the Himalaya side and moves up into the mountains, into the other side of the Kazakhstan and all. So you can see the routes that these birds take. So when the bird actually told the queen, like, this is the time that it is supposed to be sown. So this is how the practice of our communities also moved on from being a culture where they started sowing seeds whenever this bird used to come by. And till now, they grow maize, they grow pumpkin, they grow also, cucumber. This also talks about, the native foods that is found in these areas. And these are some foods which are already grown in these areas. So this is one of the things that I wanted to talk about, the migration of people, and not just people, but also birds and, fish. But if I move on to the next slide, I wanted to show you the grim reality of the story that I talked about. The point where the queen actually told the river to stay still and listen to my story and take the story downstream. This is where one of the dams, which is the Teesta Lower Dam Hydro Project, has been built. And not only has been built, the water has become still. It's not even a murmur of the sound. The water is dead. And the second part of it is like the birds have lost the way, because it was always during the time when there was a certain season and a certain flow of the river that the birds used to know, this is the time I'm supposed to come and go up to the Himalaya. But understanding this endangered species, we also know that birds do not come to our area anymore because of the change of the river patterns and the river, waves. The last slide I wanted to show you, which talks about that is the river, which is the Teesta, which kind of moves on to the downstream. And this is the dam which has been built, and almost 36 dams which is being built all across our River Teesta, which actually disrupts the flow of the river. And this is the story. And just next slide, I really wanted to, it has been very difficult for me because my brother, who had been working and fighting for River Teesta, is not my blood brother, but who actually was a great warrior to speak for River Teesta, passed away yesterday. And I dedicate this story to him and to all my fellow friends and listeners today for listening to this story. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Minket. Stay on the screen as long as you can, so then we can see you as well. Well, I know it's been a very painful time for you with the personal loss that you've suffered, but you've told the story in such a beautiful way, Minket. So very, very grateful for that. I was wondering because, you know, in the Northeast, the ways that oral traditions pass from elders to the new generation to children, how does this help us in growing these stories? I mean, how is it still happening? How much of that is left? You know, how much time do children with their phones and other technologies have to listen to the voices of their elders and to hear where their resources, where their history is coming from, right? I mean, not just the water and the dams and all, but birds and fish and the role that they played in developing human life in agriculture and so forth.
Right. So I think when we talk about oral history, we also talk about, I think oral history is a very different way of looking at it, almost like I would say it's a colonial way of looking at our way of life. And we never really differentiated between the oral history or a way of life or a ritual, because this is the way I'm wearing my dress is where I used to live. So I think that is number one way of looking at it. And the second part of it is our way of life also changed a lot after the globalization. And when we actually started moving out from our villages and our mountains for better education, and the whole idea of Y2K generation came in, I think a very big part of the chunk of detachment happened with our connection with our elders. And I think when we talk about oral stories and the folk narrative, for a very long time we have been told that these are myths. So I think myths and folk narrative kind of remains as a moral value. But I think it is time for us to even look into the ecological importance of these stories, because the story that I narrated about the relationship between Dimosel Crane and the River Teesta, and also about Kanchenjunga, is there. We can see it happening. And so the detachment that we have gone through is also because most of our education system does not give a space to kind of address our oral narratives. Somehow it has been a very cultural thing, and somehow it has been something which you can just do it as a free time, but education is different. But as long as we do not find spaces to understand our own local narratives and local culture, I think environment will just become a subject for us for a long, long time. So our elders are passing away at a very, very, it's heartening to see, especially after having like losing a brother who had a wide knowledge of these things. I think the way of connection, we need to rethink about our connection and why we need to connect with our elders, because in times of ecological crisis, I think these are the only environmental knowledge and the a kind of practices which can help us go a long way. So I hope I managed to answer this question of yours.
Oh, with many questions, Minket, but thank you. I mean, it is very interesting. Sorry, there's a noisy children's party. It's very interesting to, how we look at the juxtaposition of what is seen as stories and folklore with science and expertise and rationality and so forth. And yet the stories and the way the stories are told can be so moving and so so emotionally engaging for a young child, rather than, sometimes reading the same thing in a book, but hearing it being told.
Yes.
The whole process of the recitation of the story, right? What you learn from it, the drying of wells or the damming of rivers, and how you create new worlds from that. But I am, because I don't want to lose you, Minket, I know you have a connection. I want to open the floor as well. First of all, I'd like to ask both of you, Gauri and Minket, if you have any questions for each other. And then I'm going to open it up to the audience also to see if they have any questions. I know there are a few in the chat box, and I'll come to that. But let me first give you both an opportunity to see if you, want to enrich the conversation a bit for us.
Yeah, I was very interested in what Minket mentioned about the way in which what we might call oral history, or I might say storytelling or stories. The oral culture is so intertwined with ritual, but also a way of life, that the way you live becomes an education in itself. Um, so I wonder, Minket, if you could tell us a little bit about how, as kind of contexts and situations change, do some of the oral stories from in the local areas, do they how do they change? You know, like water is fluid. How do stories change to also adapt to uh, changing times as well? And by which I mean not just in terms of human situations, but in terms of the way ecologies change as well. And you know, how are they incorporated into the older stories as they are told? Could tell us. Is that clear?
Yeah, thank you so much, Gauri. I think with what I understand the question in terms of intertwining of oral literature and the culture that we have, I think as a community we are known as nature worshippers for a very long time. But I think as a community also we have gone through a lot of change in terms of socio political and of course different aspects of our globalized spaces. So when we talk about of safeguarding this oral literature and oral culture also, like we are doing it because it's something, it's like an identity for us now, more than a way of life. And I think in this way of life also we find spaces or kind of points to say, hey, this is what we are, and we are literally holding on to it because we do not get spaces to even practice these rituals. And I think as we are moving on towards the next generation where I think the whole idea of education becomes just in terms of data or even having academia. So this way of life becomes something very exotic and something which is far-fetched and something which is very like, the exotic India kind of a thing. So we are actually in this crossroad between practicing as a way of life and retaining it as because we are from that ancestral knowledge of safeguarding our environment. So yeah, we are very marginalized as community also. I mean, I'm from Darjeeling, so I'm not even a part of Northeast. So when we talk about Darjeeling itself talks about a very tea, timber and tourism as an industry. But I think as a community, we do not hear about these customs and ancestral knowledge, because of all of like political threat that goes into it. So yeah, I think these are a few things. So a very good question, but I think there is a renaissance of new people, new young children, youth wanting to know about it and practicing it in their own organic way. And I feel like we should celebrate that because ancestral knowledge comes in various ways and passes down in different ways. Some of us are gifted, not all of us are gifted. And whoever is gifted, we can support or we can encourage people to kind of move on and support them in this. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Minket.
Yeah. And I also kind of found in your case something very interesting about the feminine and male energy because I think this is something so interesting for us because we call our god the Idbu Debu Rum. So Idbu Debu Rum means having both the genders, actually, the male and the female. And we do not really look up high in the mountains as Idbu Debu Rum, but for us, it is just underground. For us, the God, the creator is under the ground. So I just found it very fascinating how you talked about the guardian deities, like just like the female part that you talked about was talking about the mermaids. Was it mermaids? What was it that you had mentioned?
The guardians of the well.
Yeah, the guardians of the whale. So for us, it is the Yeti who is the guardian of the forest, So we've always heard about Yeti as the monster and abominable snowman. But for us as a community, not just for the Lepcha, but Kirati community also, we have different names across the Himalayan region for Yeti, and they are the guardians of the forests. So I found that very fascinating, the
Mm.
correlation.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to open the floor for questions. You can raise your hand. You can write questions in the chat box. But there is one question to start off for you, Gauri, from Niranjan Garde. I was asking him if he wanted to ask the question himself. But anyway, I will read it for you, that in the example of the British Isles stories, can you briefly explain how the stories get constructed, transferred, transformed, and probably concretized? Are there multiple versions of the same theme, and how does one, figure out which is the most authentic representation of events? And then we have a hand up from Vijaya after that.
Okay. Wow. That's like a huge question. But thank you so much for asking. How do stories get constructed, transferred? Right. I think this is the issue of being a first generation migrant. You're on tentative ground, and I'm very aware that in the audience there are people who know this land much more deeply than I do, but I'm going to take a couple of stabs at this. And I'm going to speak from the point of view of a storyteller, looking at old stories. So I am putting a disclaimer here that there is a lot about the kind of what I can only term right now as common knowledge, things that are known without being uttered as statements. A lot about common knowledge that I may not know as deeply, but this is my sense. With the really old stories of the British Isles, you have the Celtic mythological lores. You have you have consolidated lores in Wales. For example, you have the Mabinogion. You have in Scotland, you have a wealth of old stories of the creation of the waters, the creation of the land, the deities, which are both common knowledge as well as they were extensively documented in the 18th centuries. There was this kind of period when stories were gathered and documented. And of course, Ireland has a very, very rich living tradition, oral tradition, I would say, remembered tradition. Some of this gets lost when it's a question of England. Many of the really old stories are lost. I mean, you have the Arthurian lore, but there are stories that move in and around the Arthurian lore and are independent of it, which need to be recovered. And there is a renaissance here, like Minket was talking about. Is definitely a renaissance since the 80s of remembering, collecting, getting to know the older stories. And very often these stories exist as local knowledge. You really have to go to ground. You really have to go near the sources of the waters where people will be talking about it through phrases, through riddles, through songs, through ballads. We have a great tradition of ballads. So stories pass on, in other words, and as they pass on, they get constructed and reconstructed. This is why my question on how do stories change, because I think that stories never get fossilized, and the danger of a fossilized story is huge, probably much greater than a story that you only know in fragments, because then you're arriving at a kind of authoritative version. And the nature of orality, the nature of remembering, the nature of keeping memory alive is that, as times move on elements enter and things need to be forgotten. That's a very, very important part of stories, and I think very important part of water as well. Things flow. So I think in terms of how do stories get constructed or transformed is probably through this, that, or the nature of orality is such that as the stories are passed down, certain things are lost and certain things that are more current begin to arrive. It's well worth asking, why is there suddenly a remembering of, the Voices of the Well story? Why is it acquiring so much resonance? It was probably never lost. Maybe some few people remembered it, but it's acquired a resonance. And why has it acquired a resonance? Maybe because it's tapping into something that we're really kind of confronting as a question now. So I think that's what's happening on the islands over here, that there are stories that are kind of not being told as much. And then there are other stories that are suddenly, kind of resonating, and they're finding place in poetry and, songs, in everyday speech, references that we make. Whether there are multiple versions, yes, definitely. You go to Ireland, there'll be a slightly different version of the story. You come to England, there'll be a slightly different version. Scotland has a slightly different version. Within each, depending on if you're near a holy well, if you have a dwelling or a village or a town where there has been a holy well, it'll have a different take on the story from somewhere where the story is a little more abstract. So yes, multiple versions exist. And how do you find the most authentic version? That's a tricky question. Calls into, that is really the heart of what our work as storytellers is not recovering the authentic version. Don't know what an authentic version is, but what is the version that's most authentic to you, that is also honoring the story? That's honoring the ancestors, that's honoring the tongues through which that story has passed. So probably every version is authentic. There are so many holy wells on these islands, and there are as many authentic versions as there are holy wells, and as there are rememberings of the vitality of the contract. So I would answer the question in that way.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that very sort of extensive answer. There's a hand raised from Vijaya, and then I'll come back to the question in the chat box. Vijaya?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think some part of it is already answered by Gauri.
Would you like to just briefly introduce yourself to the speakers?
Yeah, I am a faculty at PVP College, which is Padma Bhushan Vasant Patil College of Architecture in Pune. And we do talk a lot about narratives in architecture, because I felt that the strength of narratives is very visibly clear in under architecture, actually, because we talk about all these stories and narratives. So for us, it's always like more the narratives, more interesting. The entire story of architecture is always. So first of all, thank you, Minket and Gauri, for this lovely way that you have put up the two stories. It was so interesting, the way you have put that whole thing, and you've stitched it with, it's like almost a very holistic sort of a story. It is not very specific to any, it's talking about everything. That's what all the grandma stories used to be. Like, I was almost reminded about the grandma stories. We talk about everything which is more holistic, trying to bring in values, how to be sensitive to things. My question is basically a little more specific to maybe both of them, I would say, is a lot of stories have their own forms, actually. The oral narratives have their own form. Like, it is either very much connected only to a family, or it's more a tradition of performing art, actually. You'll see a lot of performing art which is connected to these stories, and that's how they used to connect it to different people. Actually, that's how the transfer used to happen, which I think you explained right now, Gauri. I would like to know if there is something very specific in terms of this oral method, way of narration, which was there in the first story, which Gauri mentioned, or even in the second, which Minket mentioned. Yeah, there is very interesting narratives in the form of some dance, or there are these whole full night they sit, and there is the entire community comes, and there is a lot of singing which is happening, folk singing which is happening, and that's how people remember, because music starts connect. You can remember those narratives actually. So I would like if you can put a little more maybe light onto some methods which are adopted, if it's possible right now in this on this platform.
In the story that I mentioned, it was mostly about the river, the Pandi song, and also it is about the princess. So I'm not aware of the downstream community song or a practice that goes on, but I do know that they actually have a ritual where they actually move about and actually pray to River Teesta. So when we even look at this, rituals that you're talking about, or any dance form, there is a folk song of the River Teesta, which actually has another story, which I have narrated earlier also. But in this one, this is my first time I'm actually narrating this story, and yet to know about it. But another song that I thought, that's probably for another time, but that talks about these two rivers coming and meeting. And it is mostly narrated the time when the shamans actually pray to the deities of the mountains. And this is the time when we have certain calendar year where we actually go to the mountain peak and actually call out the deities of the river and the mountains. So this story is narrated. And there is a song also. Actually, I'm a filmmaker, so I've made a film called Voices of Teesta. And in that, I have put the song which the shaman had, sang. So probably I can share the link with Sarah and can pass it on to all of you. You can have a look at that. But yeah, this particular story I'm not aware of, maybe in the downstream. But in the upstream, we don't have much of that practice kind of a thing. But yes, we have a lot of stories. In fact, some of these stories are taken, it takes more than 7 days to finish the story. Especially we have a story based on creation of Kanchenjunga, which has many, 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 many parts of the story. And it takes more than 7 days to finish it. Yeah. And we have also dances. And also sometimes there is a food ritual also where these stories are narrated even before preparing the dish. So yeah, that is how I would like to answer mine. Over to you, Gauri.
Yeah, I think, Vijay, as you pointed out, there are specific avenues of remembering. What I can say about this particular story is that I don't know is the honest answer. I don't know what the traditional form of telling it was. What I do know about this story is that it was forgotten. There were fragments that are now remembered. And what I have just told you is one set of fragments that's been put together, which is a very kind of contemporary revival of the story. What I can tell you about water stories is you find different modes of remembering, especially in Scotland, which is where I'm based, and I kind of have been doing my research here. You find sea shanties, sea ballads. Sea is a big part of our world here. You find stories which are the old kind of creation stories, which are told by the Shanakai, so the old storytellers. And in Scotland, they still do exist, where the tradition of storytelling is passed down in the family, and there are particular ways in which those stories are told. So there are old creation stories which are told by the traditional storytellers around here. There are not many of them, but they are still there. And the other genres through which, stories of water are passed down are now they're called kind of like Selkie stories, Kelpie stories, stories of the relationship of beings that live in the water, which are at times warning stories, at times they are wonder stories, at times they are about reminding the contract between humans and the beings underwater, where humans are told not to fish more than they need, often reminded by being kidnapped and taken under the sea. And these are in the form of folk tales or local stories. They have a certain fairy tale like element as well, slightly surreal. Ballads are a big form of passing down stories as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Gauri. Thank you, Minket. Thanks a ton.
Thank you, Vijaya. There's one more question from the PGUD, students or faculty over there. But it is something that I think both Gauri and Minket have answered. But the question is to both of you, really. I would like to know if these stories change over time and content, and does the content change over time? And can you give any examples of the same? And I think you've both sort of answered that question, but there is another question from one of our students. Don't know whether you want to ask the question yourself, Kalyani. Otherwise, I will for you. But she wanted to know how are young people looking at this art of stories and storytelling? How are the younger generation? And I think I asked you that earlier, Minket, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the project as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because sometimes when I tell stories, it breaks my heart, to be honest, because I tell stories about Yeti and magic. So there has been incidences and, cases where the children were more interested in proving there is Yeti or not than actually addressing or rejoicing the faculty of wonder. So I think these are times when children are looking for logic and looking for validation on the stories and proofs and logic in the things. So sometimes I feel that the younger generation have lost the faculty of wonder. But however, I think with these stories and the kind of the folklore that has been narrated by our ancestors kind of really catches on with few youngsters who really kind of gets fascinated with this magic that they happen and the shapeshifters that we had in our region. And I think that kind of really excites them. And there were times when I said, there used to be a lot of magic around this place. So one of the kids mentioned, how can there be a magic? Magic is bad, So I think it's also kind of really looking at how we are reflecting these stories on the children and what kind of ways they are interpreting this. So that is my answer to how the young people are kind of looking at it. But I feel like we should have more of storytellers, more of kind of looking at the science from the wonder and kind of rejoicing through the stories and through the lores and the songs and the dances. I think that's where, like Gauri had mentioned, the education is in the living, like where we are living. Otherwise, we are just literate. So I feel like the youngsters, they are fascinated, but there is this block of what will people say if I start talking about magic and stuff like that. So yeah, but I think there are a lot of people who are really interested in folk narrative now. And I just wanted to quickly kind of join to the first question that you had asked about like the stories, is there a change in the content? And Gauri also mentioned and answered it's like you can listen to the same story for the fifth time and it will be different, because it's the kind of state of mind that you're in, where you pick on things and pick on words and pick on incidences of the same story in different ways in different times. Just like you cannot cross the river twice, I think it's very, very similar with the storytelling also. And when I often, I talk about this river folklore, River Teesta, where these two lovers meet. And when I tell it to the children, they are very fascinated with this whole idea of, oh, humans and animals talking to one another. But when I tell this to probably a married couple, they kind of get associated with the male and the female fight that they had, and the way they kind of try come into a conclusion. So I think it's like, it's the same story being reflected and we becoming good listeners and kind of stretching our perspective from different ways. So I feel like as a storyteller, there are times when I feel like, oh, there are children, then I probably stress on my intonation and the way I speak on the whole magic part of it more. But I think I tell the same story. It's just how people take it differently. And as far as content is concerned, since these are folklore, which our ancestors have spoken for a very long time, and I, as one of from the community also, has a lot of responsibility to kind of pass it on to the younger generation with equal responsibility and equal humility. So I do take, I take proper care and kind of telling the stories and kind of looking from different interpretation also. But I think at the end of the day, we don't have this whole space of whom are we legitimizing? What is the correct story? Like who are we to define that? So I come from that perspective, and I think since these stories were documented by shamans, so I take permission from them and I think take it forward. So the content, as far as I'm concerned, I've tried my best to kind of move forward, but there has been interpretations here and there, and we should rejoice it because it's an oral story. And so I wanted to quickly talk also about the Living Water Museum project that we had done. Because of the detachment that we could see during the COVID-19, our elders were passing away, the youngsters were away in a city, so they had to come down during COVID-19. And I think through this project and British Council funded project, we managed to document almost 14 folk narrative of the river from the northeast communities that they had come from. So I think these projects needs to be revived. The storytelling as a storyteller also needs to find different mediums to connect with the young generation to kind of find meaning in these stories. So I think that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Minket. Gauri, did you want to add anything? I mean, there is one more question, Gauri, which you may want to take in the interest of time first, which is, have your storytelling efforts helped change people's perspectives about water and water conservation? And then I see another hand raised. So, I mean, you may want to first answer the other questions or, answer this one. It is one that we're also asked all the time. What impact do we have on the ground?
I think I'll take them all together because they're all related. Here's the thing. I started the session by saying that I came to tell and be interested in stories around water because of the kind of deep elemental connection I saw between storytelling and water. And the foundation of that link, that connection is, in stories, just as in water, if we want to get to know water, yes, I can tell you it's H2O, 2 hydrogen particles and 1 oxygen particle, and it looks like this, and we need it for science. I can give you all the facts, as Minket was saying, that, people ask for facts. But if I really, really want to know water, I have to immerse myself in it. And it's the same thing with stories. I can give you ad nauseum the source of stories. I can talk about the genres. I can talk about what is the right way of telling it or not. But unless I can tell that story where you can immerse yourself in it, it's not going to touch you. You're not going to know what the story is. And that's the fundamental of, do stories resonate with young people? In the beginning, no. You go into a session and, you have 11 to 16-year-olds. I love working with them because they're the most skeptical. And you're there as a storyteller. and they're sitting there with their hands crossed going, no, or how is this going to get me my grades, or whatever other life concerns they have going on at that point. But as they listen to a story, and if it's a well-told story, they will want that magic. Because I think in whatever age we are, we want magic in our lives. Yeah, when we give it a label, this is magic, we go like, oh, is it black magic? Is it this magic? Is it that magic? But in the moment where you're in the presence of a rainbow or a raindrop, or that first shiver of cold water when you go wild swimming or even swimming, receiving a story is like that. It's immersion. So does a story change? Have I experienced change? Yes and no. Because people ask me for more and more stories. Tell us more about the Kelpies. Tell us more about this water. Tell us more about this place. And and they ask without knowing why, which is what's interesting about stories, is when you immerse yourself in it, you find wonders and you want to know more about it. And then that knowing more makes you want to do something about it, makes you want to care. And therefore, sometimes I think, in terms of how can storytelling change or help, it's not only about getting professional storytellers in. It's about, just telling stories because you enjoy them, to your kids or in your family, around Diwali is coming up, tell a few stories, laugh around it. And there'll be a few stories that, stay there with people. This is what happened. This is why we have to take care of the migratory crane. This is what the dam is doing. It's that kind of emotional impact, which a fact will never give you. A fact will help you facilitate the change, put the change into action. But to want to have that change, the beginning with a story always works. Yeah, so I've seen changes happen. I've seen children, young people wanting to, go to the seashore, pick up stones and look at them differently. Yeah, I've seen them when they see a seal out there, they're not thinking of the animal and how can I go and touch it, but how do I kind of take care so that the animal doesn't get frightened? And that's a beginning, which leads to its own kind of changes. So yeah, I think our task as storytellers is to be custodians, to be aware that we foster multiple versions of the same story, that, certain stories are guarded and their sacredness. So I think Vijaya talked about sacred stories. Now there's something to a ritual in telling a sacred story as a sacred story. Those need to be kind of, those need guardianship. But then there are so many other stories where, you and I can be guardians. So I think there's something about the culture of storytelling that needs to be fostered rather than just telling one particular story. That answers the question. And with a story example, I'll just give a short 30-second example. I was at a festival day before yesterday where there was a Scottish storyteller who told the story of a selkie, which is a seal. And there are lots of stories of seals on the west of Scotland because that's the animal you find. That's the animal that's hunted. And this story is a very, very well-known story of a fisherman who finds the skin of a seal, takes the skin and makes the woman. So selkies often are women when they take off their seals, or when they take off their seal skin, steals the skin, So the woman who is the seal being is forced to come with him and makes her his wife. And then they live happily, blah, blah, blah. And many years down the line, she finds her skin and goes back into the sea because that's the call of her home. This story has been told in many ways, reinterpreted by storytellers from the point of view of the woman, from the point of view of the seal, from, the atrocity of the male, etc., etc. Now, this was a male storyteller. He told the story, but he told us this is a story of that story that my daughter and I came to it together. So he used to tell the story to his daughter, 8, 9 years old. And the entire story is from the point of view of the seal challenging the man. Why are you taking my skin? And he says, well, that's the story. I take your skin, you come with me. And she says, no, you can't do that because I'm going to bite your nose off. I have seal teeth. Now that is a child's voice coming in. And then he says, but you can't do that. And she says, give me my skin back. So he gives it back to her. And he says, I've given you your skin back. Now you're supposed to come with me. And she says, no, you haven't done any great thing by giving me my skin back. That skin is mine. It was not yours to take in the first place. Suddenly, it's bringing in questions of appropriation. It's bringing in all sorts of questions. And then she says to him, fine, you've given me my skin back, but this is a story of stealing the skin that everyone in your community knows. What's to say the next time some other man from your community won't steal someone else's skin? And he says, but what should I do? She says, well, you've got to tell the story in your community of how you gave my skin back. And so he goes back and he starts telling his family that he's given the skin back, and they laugh at him and they bully him. And they say to him, oh, we're going to go down to the pub and tell the whole village. And he turns around to his family and he says, no, you're not going to tell the story. I'm going to tell the story to the whole village because it's important. That skin is not ours to take. And, in that moment, this is a male storyteller who's told us a story of how to treat the beings of water, how to treat water, and how to change a story. And it's a story that he came up with his daughter. So I think the more the younger generation hears stories, the more they will find how to introduce changes and how to take responsibility. I think that's really important in stories. So, yeah.
So it's a very, very powerful point. And it actually goes back to your well story also, because in a way, what the woman, the selkie is doing, she's also articulating voice. It's about empowerment. It's about the female finding her agency and her voice and questioning some of the practices that happened around that. But
without accusing, I think that's also really important with stories.
Without being strident about it. We really will have to wind up soon. I know this conversation can go on, but I have one hand from Yami Chaudhary, and I'd like you to ask your question and to just briefly say who you are, Yami.
Hi, I'm a researcher here based in New Delhi. Thank you for the wonderful stories you both gave, Gauri and Minket. My question is directed towards Minket, and Gauri, please feel free to say your words. You said how the younger people are also are getting away from the oral traditional story, but there are few who are taking it up. I wanted to know if the digital platforms that have come up in last 5 years, 10 years, are these really facilitating these storytelling? Because now it's become quite easy to explain them, to also, for example, the graphics with all those things. You can the magical element could be brought back into and could be shown in different ways. So could you please let me know how the scene about this is? Thank you.
Yeah, right. So I'll just go first, Gauri. So I think in terms of digital platform is concerned, I think it was always there in terms of Snow White, Rapunzel, all these stories. It's just that when we look at from the Eastern perspective, this storytelling that we have is also trying to find a platform in these digital platforms. Or for that matter, even the Japanese, I think anime, all these are inspired by folk narratives and folklore. So yes, there are, there are spaces and there has been interest. In fact, in Living Water Museum, one girl from Arunachal Pradesh, she made a paper cut of the characters and she animated and she actually made a video out of the folk narrative that was coming from our mother's tribe. So I think there are more of these medium that's coming, and that's another form of actually, presenting a story and kind of representing the story in different medium. But I must remind everybody, because one part of this, kind of info. Yeah, so digital platform as a medium is interesting to induce interest in people and also the young generation. But I think the whole idea of telling a story, sitting down as a human to human, I think that's something the core of storytelling. And I think that's what we are missing. But the human to human connection of sitting down and listening to the person. And as we talk about oral stories, more than telling the story, it is also to become listeners. I think the whole idea of becoming storytelling or need of storytellers. I think I'm going on and off, so yeah, I just would like to wind up by saying, yeah, this new medium is good, but we need to be listeners to find a platform for oral stories.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Gauri, you can go ahead.
You then just wanted to thank you again.
I would pretty much agree with Minket that there is something about listening to a human voice and meeting their eyes, which digital platforms can't quite create that intimacy and that kind of connection. Having said that, I've also found, so I think where the digital platform really helps is it acknowledges for the younger generation that is, in a sense, their medium of communication. Children, I mean, I was born in a generation where there wasn't an internet, but I think for the younger generation now, their phones are almost an extension, whether for good or bad, of their hands in a way, or their eyes. So I have found that in asking the younger generation to recreate or retell a story, where the digital platform is a tool that they can use, the story acquires a different resonance, one more layer, if you will, because it's become part of the language of the younger generation. At the same time, I think the danger is in where the digital platform may divorce the younger generation from going out and viscerally feeling, because senses are a very important part of listening and telling a story. It's part of the oral culture. So it's not a substitute, but in certain situations, the digital platform can enhance. It can definitely amplify the voice of a storyteller. It can amplify the voice of a story. So yes and no in response to what Yamin was asking.
Thank you, both of you. Pushkar, would you like to just say a few closing words?
Absolutely. Thank you both. We learned that stories are the records of community. This is how communities build up their own archives. These archives are extremely malleable and will change in response to the anxieties of the community itself. And therefore, we have to really treasure them and keep them alive. I mean, the whole study of folkloristics, which was so big in the 70s and 80s, seems to have gone down, but hopefully it will see some kind of revival. In any case, the worlds of enchantment and wonder also do respond to realities of climate change and environmental degradation. And I think, therefore, having this old dichotomy of the fantastic versus the rational just will not work. I mean, they do engage and talk to each other in very meaningful ways. In any case, thank you and Minket both for having given us a wonderful hour and a half, not just of information, but also of stories. And on behalf of the Center of Water Research and also ISER Pune, I would like to thank both of you. And thank you to the audience for being here patiently.
Great. Okay, and then we will make available.
Thank you everyone.
Yeah, this recording will be shared on the ISER YouTube in a week's time, I think. So you can hear it again. Thank you, everyone.